Ladies and gentlemen, it is 5:23 p.m. on a Tuesday, Central Time in the United States. And right now, all around the world, incredible and terrifying things are happening. Kanye West admitted to an incestuous relationship with his cousin. Donald Trump wants to revoke Harvard University's tax breaks. The war in the Donbass is as violent and terrible as ever.
Oh,
But we don't care about any of that, do we, Smokey?
no, we do not.
Of course we don't, because right now, and for the next hour or so, we are in the Garden of Eden. We are in a perfect bubble, and that is Smokey's very own philosophy corner. How you doing, Smoke?
I'm doing well. Been eating lots of honey.
Good. I'm so glad to hear it.
How are you doing, Mr. Thanasi?
Oh, I'm loving it. I'm enjoying my cigar right here.
There you go.
I'm excited to talk about the only thing that really matters in this world, and that is the thoughts and the writings of dead people.
That's not a bad way to start an introduction. You're right.
Speaking of which, what are we covering today?
Well, we are starting to read Aristotle's categories, which, in my opinion, is one of the best things ever written, considering it wasn't written as a book. Um, when you think of old literature and you think of Aristotle, you often think, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And Categories is one of those books that I think a lot of people sort of forget about because, it's a book on logic. And we think of Aristotle as a scientist, not as a logician.
Mm,
But I think it's a really important book to read, and with the people I work with, I think they could do with reading it, to be quite honest. Um, uh, and in fact, until probably for another 1,500 years after this book is written, there's really not a better book on logic written than Categories. Which is not to say it's perfect, but it's a really good book.
good, good. Well, I'm
Waxed
very excited
philosophical
to
enough.
very much. I'm excited to break into it with you. I feel honored to, dig into something that's held in such high regard by none other than Smokey, the
The bear
philosopher bear.
community is, for the most part, for Socrates, but some of us are
Mhm.
willing to slack a little bit for Aristotle.
Good, good. Well, I'll once we finish this up, I'll see what side of the fence I'm on when it comes to the wrath of the bear community.
Well, we can be a bit gruff, and we're always doing something in the woods. All right, so categories. It's broken up into three parts. There's sort of the introduction, then there is the section on categories, and then there's sort of the ante or the past or the sort of the end, cleaning up comments. And so what we're going to be doing for the next couple of readings is we're just reading the before. And I don't want to get into the Greek, but all we're going to do is we're going to read probably about 3 or 4 sections. That gets us to where he finally starts to define what categories are, or
Okay,
what the categories are. Um,
okay,
but these first couple of readings, they're not categories. They're not what he would call true categories. They're just examples of how we use language to identify categories. Does that make sense?
it does.
Okay. Are we ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Categories translated by E.M. Edgehill. Section 1, Part 1. Things are said to be named equivocally when, though they have a common name, the definition corresponding with the name differs for each. Thus, a real man and a figure in a picture can both lay claim to the name animal. Yet these are equivocally so named, for, though they have a common name, the definition corresponding with the name differs for each. For should anyone define in what sense each is an animal, his definition in the one case will be appropriate to that case only.
Mm.
On the other hand, things are said to be named univocally, which have both the name and the definition answering to the name in common. A man and an ox are both animal, and these are univocally so named, insomuch as not only the name, but also the definition is the same in both cases. For if a man should state in what sense each is an animal, the statement in the one case would be identical with that in the other. Finally, things are said to be named derivatively, which derive their name from some other name, but differ from it in termination. Thus, the grammarian derives his name from the word grammar, and the courageous man from the word courage. And so, thus endeth the reading. Now beginneth the. Do you understand what you just read?
That's almost a guarantee to be a no, but I suppose it's relative to what your expectations are. The
The thing to
first
the thing.
part here,
Oh,
sorry, go ahead,
well, I
please.
was going to say the thing to remember is almost invariably people get into arguments over definitions.
Mm,
And so you want to be careful and you want to make sure everybody understands your definition.
right. At the end of the day, this first part is primarily the claim. Here are three ways that people name things,
Yes,
and here's what each of those ways are.
yes,
Okay.
it
I
is.
noticed that each of these are things are said to be named. The said it does a little bit of heavy lifting there,
Oh, yes.
in that I suppose if you were to ask Aristotle, if you were to ask him who is saying this, are you saying that all people? And he would say, maybe, maybe not. That's not the point. The point is that some people seem to name things equivocally or univocally or derivatively, and they do it meaning this method.
Yes. And we're
Gotcha.
not saying that one method is superior to another. We're simply
Mm.
saying that these methods exist.
Well, Smokey, obviously, like you just said, there's no hierarchy here. There's not intended to be a hierarchy here. In your opinion, could you view these hierarchically?
Nope.
Do you? And what would be the order?
Nope.
Okay, just categorically then.
It's just strictly categorical. And I got a PowerPoint because bears make PowerPoints in the woods.
Yeah, for the listeners, in case you didn't know, bears are some of the greatest PowerPoint presenters of all time. You guys are in for a real treat.
So if we look, if we look here,
Hmm.
here's a visualization. This is a model of what we mean when we say we are speaking on things equivocally. We're saying I can have a definition for man. I can have a separate definition for a man in a picture, but both definitions can put these two things into the category of animal.
Hmm.
They're not the same definitions, and they are not the same things. Now, in this case, we're not saying that animal is a category because he hasn't told us what his categories are. And if you've read ahead, don't cheat. I mean, do cheat, but be careful.
Heat in the
But he's
comments.
simply using animal as an example. I can use a definition that is equivocal. If I do that, then I have to have at least two definitions. They have to be different. And I don't want to bring the modernity into it. We're just going to use his language. He says, I've got, and it's not even a man in a picture, it's just a picture. But he's saying, here's a man. And if you go back to the Greek, it's probably a man in a picture or a being in a picture. But it's a man. I can look at a man and I can look at a picture of a man and I can say that they are both animals. But how I
Right.
define what is an animal has to be different for those two entities because they're not equal. So their definitions
To
cannot
make sure I
be.
understand, right. To make sure I understand, I want to see if I can provide a counterexample. What comes to mind is the word book. And if there are equivocal definitions of the word book, then it would be two definitions that fittingly define book, but they're two separate definitions. So if I were to refer to book and define it as a collection of loose leaf papers that are then bound by a cover intended to be read as a singular item. That'd be a definition of book. And then if I were to also define book as the act of someone reserving a particular space for future use or occupation, they're booking that space. Those would be equivocal definitions. Am I right about that?
If you're saying that there's only one thing called book,
Can you elaborate?
certainly in your example, and this is why his categories become important later, in most people's minds, those are two separate categories.
I see.
A better equivocal definition would be a book is a combination of pages with a binder, or a book is paper with ink.
I understand now. I feel like my brain just grew 50%. I got it.
Or you could even say something like what most people would call papyrus. You could you could give a definition for that. Yes, it's not necessarily a book, but it has the equivalence or value of a book, right? A scroll, papyrus scroll.
Okay.
Does that not convey the idea of a book, even though it's technically not a book?
Right.
A picture of a man is not an animal, but technically it is a picture of an animal.
Right.
So when we use equivocal, we're simply saying I can create definitions to put things in categories, but those definitions don't necessarily have to agree. It's we have to agree on what we're thinking.
This is fascinating. Okay. I understand. Thinking of another example, this is very hard to think of a counter example.
Yep,
You did it very quickly. You totally one upped me, and I'm kind of mad about it,
you're
but that's
welcome.
okay. We can keep moving forward. I might want to return to this, but if that's okay with you.
That's perfectly okay with me. Because bears get a lot of things wrong in the woods. Now, if we go to the next point that he made, he said we can also think, and this is why animal isn't a true category, because, well, we're going to get into that later. He says we can come up with a definition, and the definition fits both man and oxen. So I can come up with a definition for man that does not include ox. Yes,
Right.
I would say something like two-legged, right? Walks bipedally. Well, that's not an ox. Those of you that have ever seen an ox, you know that ox are not bipedal, quadrupedal. So I could come up with a definition for man that would still fit the category of animal. Yes,
Yes.
but I could also come up with a single definition, univocal, one voice. I can come up with a definition of animal that encompasses both man and ox. If I do
Right.
that, then that definition is univocal. Now, I'll return to your original question. Do I see hierarchy or greater utility in one over the other? It depends.
Contextually, it depends.
It depends. It will always depend. For those who are, and I hesitate to say this, but when you think about it, an equivocal or equivocal definition allows for the introduction of novel ideas,
Mm.
whereas the univocal definition requires conservation.
When you say the introduction of novel ideas,
Yes.
what that means to me, correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, but what that means to me is it leaves the opportunity open for someone to look at a thing that others have looked at, but to look at it from a different angle and to take a different opinion or perspective on it. But in order to make sure that everyone knows that they're commenting on the same thing, they need to be able to call it the same name. But
Yes.
in order to convey the novelty of the idea, they need to be able to define it differently. Those two
Yes.
things are necessary functions in order for there to be a novel idea.
Yes. And
Okay.
that's tricky.
Yeah, that is
That's
tricky.
but it's also tricky to be univocal.
Sure.
I give you the duck-billed platypus.
Right. Duckbill platypus is a great example of univocality starting to struggle in its use case. The first thing that came to my mind is that if you wanted anything to be a true category, technically, then you have to take a univocal definition that is so overwhelmingly encompassing that it loses its use case and applicability entirely.
And that, yeah, and that's at the heart of philosophy
Mm.
and research in the sciences is value. At what point does a lack of value impede the importance of what we do?
Outcome versus process.
Yes,
Mm.
it's very much a concern. I can sit in a cave, eating my honey all day long, but eventually I've got to take my ideas out there and I've got to share them. But at what point are those ideas ready to be shared? It's a question we all struggle with.
And I can see where this starts to immediately get dangerous because when you introduce value, then you start to drag in morality. And when
Yeah.
you start to drag in morality, then the conversation ends. If
Yep.
I were to say, you should be a good person, and you respond to me, why should I be a good person? That just makes it easier for people to take advantage of me. Where does the conversation go from there?
Or what's even more difficult, what if I say I am being a good person? Your definition of good person, I disagree with.
Yeah, you're right. What if you were to say that the best way you can be a good person is to put yourself first because that's your first responsibility?
And how is it not a good thing that I do put myself first? Or is not me putting myself first give me the greatest opportunity to help others?
Right.
If you've ever been on a plane, what do they tell you to do when the mask comes down?
Put your mask on first before you try to help others put theirs on.
Oh, it's an interesting philosophy.
Yeah.
Ah, I we
Okay.
got we waxed a little poetic.
I
I didn't
like it.
get to the third slide. The third way we can name things is he says it's derivative. We take
Mm.
a concept or an idea such as grammar and we use a definition that allows us to identify the case, the grammarian. So I can either build up a category by using definitions, or I can tear down and create new categories using those same or using different definitions. And so language, our use of language is probably the most important thing we can or that we should concern ourselves with when considering philosophy.
Mm.
The second we stop talking to one another, the second we stop listening to one another, is when philosophy dies.
Right.
Questions?
Well, the derivative,
Yes.
to name something derivatively, is comparatively to the other two methods. to name something derivatively seems so on its face, clear in its value, and so much more simple to grasp and to think of examples for. I could see it almost being overshadowed generally in the discourse of pretty much anything, of any philosophical issue or any other issue, really. Am I right in thinking that?
Nope.
Okay. It's
No,
not overshadowed. People do keep it in mind.
no, it is not. In fact, all three play a very important role, even in modern philosophy.
Okay.
And that word derivative, think about it. If you ever took a advanced mathematical course, you've learned about derivatives. And the way we think about derivatives in mathematics is the same way that he's thinking about derivatives here. Well, with a little variation. But Aristotle lays the foundation for the humanities here in categories. The
Mm.
humanities encompasses language and mathematics. And he's laying that foundation right here. He's saying there are three ways to uh, create definitions to define things. Well, three, mathematics. There are three ways to define things, definitions, language. He lays the foundation for the logic in humanities right here. And we have been building on it and tearing ourselves on it for the last 2,000 years.
So something that we should recognize as we move forward in this paper is A, these three ways of naming things, these three methods are going to be applied throughout the paper. Am I right about that?
Oh yeah, yeah. Throughout the paper and still being applied in the world today. Did I steal your thunder?
No, not at all. Um, the next thing is that we should recognize that each of these definitions of these three methods are univocal definitions. Am I right about that?
They're not univocal. Only one is univocal. Now, are you saying that each one is separate from the others?
Well, they certainly mutually exclusive,
Yes.
but that there's going to be multiple applications that we'll see in this paper of each of these methods. And as we see those applications, the they'll fit perfectly into one of those three methods.
Now there is sort of this crazy idea of unity in your definitions, where what if you can get a derivative, a univocal, and a definition to be equal, and then you can take the equivocal definitions and write them in such a way that it becomes univocal, then you have a single definition that defines everything. And it's a bit silly because as soon as you say something can be equivocal, there is no unity. There will always be uh, groups.
So not only is that concept paradoxical, it also has no use case.
I wouldn't go that far. I would say it's paradoxical. I wouldn't go so far as to say it has no use case. You can probably find one. I'm just not bright enough to know.
Well, I want to think about that real quick because when I hear that if there's a definition that defines everything, then it loses the significance of what the definition is supposed to be. A
That's it.
definition is intended to help identify what the difference is between one thing and another. But if you're going to have a definition that defines everything, then there's no juxtaposition, so there's no need for it.
Oh, wait a second. You said that if you can come up with a definition that defines everything, then there's no need for the definition. Is that what?
Right. So if we have everything, and then if somebody asks me for the definition, I'm going to tell them all things. It's tautological.
So then you're saying that a definition by its very nature has to be something that juxtaposes your definition against another reality.
Yeah, or at least there has to be some sort of juxtaposition, or else there's no point in pointing it out. Why would I point
Now
something out versus pointing something else out if all that I'm pointing out is everything? What am I
that
doing?
works for equivocal. I wonder how does that work for univocal?
Well, I think that's where I was talking about the applicability of univocality, right? So if we were to, and I'm riffing right now based off of
Certainly.
what we just read, but if we were to try to find a univocal definition that was so univocal that
Universal.
it became universal, correct? Then when somebody calls to mind that definition, they're calling to mind all of reality. They're calling to mind everything.
Yes.
And that changes absolutely nothing. It doesn't achieve anything. There's nothing to do with that. What do you right? If
What are
I
we
say look at that and you say look at what? And I go look at it all. Look at all things. Look at everything.
and what are we dancing on the edges of?
Uh schizophrenia? I
No,
don't know.
no, 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 no. Starts with meta.
Well, metaphysics,
Metaphysics.
but even metaphysics has a difference. Metaphysics has a limiter on it. That's the whole point. If somebody were to say metaphysics, if somebody were to say metaphysics and another person asks what's that, and they say, well, it's all of reality that is outside of the material world, and the other person goes, okay, I understand, so the material world is not metaphysical, and then somebody says, well, it is, because the material world is also existing in the metaphysical world.
Yes.
That's a true statement, but
No, you
you
hold it to be true.
okay, one, it's a statement that one holds to be true, but then metaphysics loses its significance because it means both things. It doesn't. There's no differentiator there, right? The significance of the definition of metaphysics. Let me look up the definition of
Are
metaphysics.
you sure you're not a 19th century German
I might be. I
and
thought we
not a
weren't
21st
modernizing
century
things.
Greek Texan?
I thought we weren't modernizing things, Smokey.
That is true. That is
Let
true.
me look up the definition of metaphysics here, because all that I'm saying is that if if we if we wanted to use a definition that encompassed everything, then we could probably. And the definition would be all things. That would be the definition. And then nobody would use that term. Nobody would use that name because there's no point to it. You're not juxtaposing anything against anything else. So you can't really make any claims from there.
Now you're starting to sound like a Russian.
Okay. Well, I don't know why you're being so racist, sir. Okay. I didn't know bears felt this way. All right. I don't know what your problem is between
bears,
Russians and Germans.
bears, we read a lot and we think a lot and we
So
eat lots of honey.
here's a definition of metaphysics: the branch of philosophy that deals with the first principles of things, including abstract concepts such as being, knowing, substance, cause, identity, time, and space.
Yeah.
If there was a follow up sentence that said, it also covers all other branches of philosophy and all other principles of things, and like the in abstract as well as the abstract. Well, then that would be a now would be a definition of everything, and it
Yes.
wouldn't mean anything.
Yes. But in about third or fourth grade, you wrestled with this idea.
That's actually true. I'm just saying that I don't see the significance or the
In about third or fourth grade, your math teacher taught you that there were numbers and there was the set, and they started teaching you things about sets.
right.
And then they showed you that fancy R. It stands for real numbers. Then you
Sure.
have the mundane R, which was just real numbers. So you're already being introduced to, but then there was a big circle that said all numbers, all values. And it was inside that you had little circles that showed, okay, here's the imaginary numbers, here's the real numbers. Here are numbers that and go on and on and on and on. And they got all these different names and they're creating all these categories. So even as early as 7, 8 years of age, you're learning about categories and sets and how definitions are used to create these categories. And in mathematics, they take this pretty seriously and they actually believe they have a definition that can be used to define everything. And that's where the term unity and universality comes into play. The
Okay.
terms. So whether or not it's useful, that's a different question.
Oh, that was the only question that I was asking. I'm not saying I wasn't making a case as to whether or not it should or shouldn't exist, or if it's possible, or whether it's something that people could or should pursue. I just didn't see any. It was not immediately obvious to me.
A theologian might say that the definition of everything is God.
I agree.
I figure we've been dancing around it. We might as well take it out on the floor, see how it moves.
Well, that's the thing. So if you were to say what's the definition of everything, and somebody were to say God, I would say no, that's a name. If and then if somebody goes, okay, well then the definition of God is everything, then I would say, well then it doesn't sound like you're telling me a whole lot because I have no idea what the fuck you're talking about, right?
I would not disagree.
So that's all that I'm saying. But I'm not saying that that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be pursued or something. I don't know. I just don't see very much use
Well,
to gotten out of it.
you do recognize there are three ways that Aristotle says we can define things.
Yes.
And you understand that those three ways are discrete from one another.
Discrete from one another. I think the term I used was mutually exclusive. Is that fair or
Mutually exclusive.
discrete?
Yes, mutually.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
That would be an equivocal definition.
Yes. Okay. Gotcha. I love it. Okay.
All right.
Well, Smokey, is there anything else you wanted to cover before I wrap up here and also look to the future?
Nope, I got to go get my honey pot.
Love it. All right. As long as it's honey pot and not pot, okay? We live in the United States. Nobody smokes pot around here.
Oh.
Also,
Oh.
nobody calls it pot. I don't know why I'm referring it to it that way. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm like shifting. I'm 19th century German, and then I'm Russian, and then I'm 60. I'm confused.
Okay, boomer.
Exactly. Very much. Um, well, for the listeners, what are we plan to do here? And it'll be evident in our introduction video, which will be pinned at the top of our channel once we record it and post it. But we plan to read a part of Aristotle's categories every Tuesday, record it, and post it the following Thursday. This will be posted this upcoming Thursday. Smokey, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Nope, you're good.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing you again on Tuesday, Smokey.
Me
And
too.
yeah, this is a good start.
All right, brother. Have a good week.
You as well.